Well, yeah. Hey, let's go ahead and start it. Mr. Dring, I appreciate you coming on. We're going to be talking about Joe Louis today. So I got some questions, but man, me being historian, podcaster, I think that, I can read articles about this guy. I never got to train with him, but I know what an influence he's had on you. And man, I would just like to document some of that. And like, what can you tell me and our audience about Joe Louis?
And Joe was a huge influence in my career from the time I first got going in martial arts. I mean, he was on the cover of all the magazines. I mean, as a teenager, I was watching him in the movies, Jaguar Lives and Force 5. And, Joe was in some movies. He had some cameo appearances in some TV shows. I first met Joe Louis in 1981 at a United States Taekwondo Federation, USTF tournament. It was right after Jim Botein had pulled out of the ATA. Jim Botein had a string of Taekwondo plus schools, Nautilus locations, Nautilus plus Taekwondo type places in central Arkansas. And in fact, I think he had a location in Texarkana. But at the time, I mean, he started teaching. Botein started teaching in Jacksonville, and then he opened up North Little Rock, opened up in Rodney Parham, had bought the old Harry Brace Roman Spa that was on University, but there was no martial arts being taught there because of the Rodney Parham location. That was strictly a health club. He had a location down in Texarkana. Well, when Botein, just because the ATA's business model changed, and they were going to require things that Botein thought, well, I innovated and developed, I shouldn't have to pay for, in a nutshell, without going into all the details. So, and they were changing up their Taekwondo. I think, some people would say watering it down to make it more palatable to the masses, so to speak. So anyway, there were business reasons involved. So Botein broke away, then he formed the United States Taekwondo Federation. The very first Taekwondo tournament that the USTF held was in Searcy, Arkansas. And the guests were Anthony the Amp Elmore, who was a world super heavyweight kickboxing champion, and Joe Louis. So at this time, I'm wanting to say, because it was early in 81, and I was a blue belt, I believe, in Taekwondo at that time. And had been training for a couple of years, but I trained in Shotokan when I was attending college at Baylor, and Taekwondo when I would come back to Arkansas. Well, I had just at this time had moved back to Arkansas. Let me get my timing straight here.
It's just 30 years ago.
Yeah. So anyway, he had, I get to thinking now, I'm questioning myself. It could have been, I'm pretty sure it was in 81. Anyway, we broke away, and I was working, as I want to say, I was working for Botein when he broke away from the USTF. I was working as a Nautilus instructor, working my, going to college at UALR, working on my degree, and training with, So Anthony Elmore and Joe Louis came down and did a seminar. And I think somewhere I still have a broken karate board, pine board, and have both of those guys' signatures on that board. Well, I mean, that was really cool to me. Joe was making a comeback. So he was in his 40s at the time, and was making a comeback as a kickboxer. and had been doing some training with Anthony Elmore at Anthony's house in Memphis. So they ran over to Searcy and were the guests at this tournament. Fast forward a couple of years, Keith Kirk, who was at that time Pasaru under Kang Ree in Memphis. Keith was big on the open tournament circuit then in Arkansas, and definitely a hardcore martial artist. He's now living in Memphis and is predominantly a Shotokan stylist now. But Keith was a fantastic martial artist. And I mean, by anybody's standards then and today, was really a tough guy. And in fact, we used to, our school, my school, and his school, we often got together and sparred. I'd take my guys over to his gym and we'd work out and then go out to eat, or he'd bring his guys over to my gym and we'd spar. And they were all really, really tough guys, So when Keith, naturally, when he brought Joe in for some seminars, man, I always supported. And so I had the opportunity to work out at a couple of Joe Louis seminars at his school. And this is 82, 83, 84 time range, maybe even 85. So in that period, it was a year or two after, and I was a low ranking. By this time I'd earned my black belt in Taekwondo and was a young, very, very young black belt, young man, still in college at that time. And working out, I'd hit seminars that he went to. To me, it was cool. I'd read about this guy in the magazines. I'd watched him on the big screen. So, and he was an intense. Young Joe Louis was pretty freaking intense. And then fast forward a little bit more, and I open up my own gym. Man, I'm sitting in my office one day, and he calls me up and says, "Hey, I'm going to be coming through town. Like to know if you'd like to do a seminar." And I was like, yes, yeah, definitely, man. I thought it was so cool. Wow, Joe Louis just called me, and so he did a couple of seminars at my school when I was on the corner of JFK and McCain in the North Park Mall. And he'd come through town, and he was in a van, had his wife with him. We'd train, went out to eat, go have a bite. And it was really cool. So that was mid 80s, probably 86, 87, 88, somewhere in there. And then just lost contact with them for just a couple of years. I want to say 88, 89, 88 was probably the last time I trained with them. And then bump forward a few more years, I moved into my location. I've been in this location here in Sherwood since October of 89. I was in the North Park Mall after I bought my school from Jim Botine. I moved it into my own location. I bought it in 85. I moved it into my own location, open for business March 3rd, 1986. Then I moved into this location in October. So I was in the North Park Mall for 3.5 years, and I've been here continuously since October of 89. I had a student that was into Jeet Kune Do, and of course the Tao of Jeet Kune Do was my bedside. I had read that book. And I'm a pretty, I like to read, so I'm a big reader, and still have tons of martial art books that I try to digest on a regular basis. So Jeet Kune Do and Joe, and I knew that Joe had trained privately with Bruce Lee. I thought that was really interesting, really cool. So I had a student that wanted to go to this camp at Radford University. There's a gentleman there by the name of Jerry Beasley, Dr. Jerry Beasley. And he put on an Radford University Jeet Kune Do camp. And this was various Bruce Lee people, Howard Williams, Ted Wong,
Nice.
was teaching the first year, and then that was great. And those were, at that time in American martial arts, there was a big, there was a lot of discussion between the concept JKD guys and what Bruce Lee was practicing at the time of his death, original art JKD guys. You know, so you kind of had Dan Inosanto's crew, who was best friends with Bruce Lee, and really focused in on, but they were more conceptual. They were taking a lot of his concepts, but they were really going into the, you know, Penjak Salat and the Muay Thai and the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they were using that kind of conceptual outfighting, infighting, trapping, grappling, and on the mat. So they were taking those ideas. Then you have the group of guys that were training with Bruce Lee that wanted to keep doing what they were doing when they were training with Bruce. And so kind of the original art kind of guys. And it's funny to me, I see some of that paralleled with the sport jiu-jitsu versus the self-defense jiu-jitsu guys. You know, hey, we do official Gracie jiu-jitsu, and then we got the Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and we're more, you know, arose by any other name, you know. But it's kind of interesting how those history repeats itself, so to speak, because you can see the parallels. Well, I went to the JKD camp the first year and absolutely enjoyed it. Man, it was a very academic. Radford is, you know, it's an Eastern university. It's beautiful in the hills of Virginia. I mean, it's absolutely a gorgeous campus. And the training was legit. And it was interesting, you know, from an academic point of view. The next year, I went back because I enjoyed it so much the first year. And this time, Joe Louis was the instructor. And this was in 94. So Joe called me up. I mean, he recognized me right away, and he had just a brilliant memory. You know, I mean, he could recall names and faces and dates, and he was very interesting like that. He was along those lines, and I'll touch on this more later, but I think he was untrained genius. You know, never went to college, but he was brilliant in his own way. But he wasn't cultivated the way the academic process cultivates you. He didn't have anybody to kind of check him and question him and guide him. But yet he was hyper intelligent. I mean, he was brilliant in his own ways. So when at that camp, Joe called me up and used me because he knew who I was. They used me as an uke the entire camp because I just hung with them. I mean, as soon as I saw he was there, I mean, I was at every one of the classes he taught, regardless of the rotation. I was going to work out with Joe. He was hardcore, and he used me as an uke the entire time. And there were a couple of drills that we did that I caught his attention because I was hanging with him. And he made mention, Joe, if Joe ever said anything nice to you, you wrote that down, because he didn't say anything nice about anybody. I mean, you know, Joe could be an ass that just spade a spade. I mean, that's just the way it is, you know. I mean, he could be gruff, you know, he was curmudgeonous and gruff, and I mean, we all loved him for it. So if he bothered to take the time to tell you something nice, you know, I mean, I can count on the fingers of one hand, you know, but when he did, man, you wrote it down. And we did a particular round kicking drill. We were going back and forth. And this is why I was still fighting in the ring then. You know, I mean, I was still competing and fighting in the ring. And he just flat said, man, you know, most people can't hang with me like that. A year later, I get a phone call from a guy by the name of Mark Miskelly, who was putting together some stuff for Joe. And they asked me if I wanted to teach with Bill Wallace and Joe Lewis and Jerry Beasley. And of course, Dr. Beasley was well published. You know, I mean, Radford University was one of the few places in the country where you could get a martial arts degree. And Dr. Beasley still writes, and you know, he has the Karate College, which is one of the most well-known and well-respected martial art camps in the world. So
this guy's still alive?
Dr. Beasley? Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That'd be a cool guy to podcast with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We can make that happen. So that I get the call going, hey, would you like to teach this all-star karate camp with Wallace and Lewis and Beasley in Tulsa, Oklahoma? And so I kind of did one of those, hang on just a second. Yes, I think I would, you know. I mean, you know, they gave me a date. Let me see if I'm free. Yes, I'm free. So that was really cool. That was my first time to get to actually share the teaching stage with those guys. And so that was in 95. And then they had me start teaching at the Karate College. And out at Radford. And so I was going out there, and I taught there for a dozen years, drove out. And the Karate College was really cool. And not only was I getting to spend time with Joe, but also Bill Wallace. But, you know, Henzo Gracie was teaching there, Gokar Chavichian. They were bringing in, it was a veritable who's who in the martial arts was coming through that camp, and Benny Urquidez, and I mean, you name it. There were so many high level guys in the country that would go through and teach at the Karate College. That at that time in my career, as far as getting nationwide notoriety and being exposed to a lot of people, and that was huge. It was huge in my career, and it all happened because of Joe. I'd never have had that opportunity if it weren't for Joe Lewis. And it was interesting. One of the first, you know, when the UFC first came out, it was in December of '93 was the first UFC in Denver, Colorado. Well, shortly after that, another upstart group for that style of fighting form called the IFC, the International Fighting Championship. Yeah. And so the IFC back then was pretty much like Bellator is today, right? So you had the UFC, and then you had the IFC, and then some other shows. And this is pre-Pride. I mean, this was really in the early days. Well, the IFC did a show in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Joe was the commentator. And that was the first, I had a girl, the very first female it was a female tournament. It had 4 women in it, and it was the first women's MMA tournament in the U.S. And I had one of my girls fought in that. So it was interesting to go down, hang out with Joe. He was commentating, and then got to kind of hang out with them. So that was really cool. Joe was absolutely, as far as technique goes, was brilliant. It's funny because I was talking about Bruce Lee. He'd flat go, man, I don't know what Bruce Lee taught anybody else. I worked out with him personally. I was already a world champion. The first time Bruce came to Joe and wanted him to work out with him, Joe said no. He said, because at that stage in Bruce's career, he was still a little more heavily influenced with the Wing Chun and hadn't branched out quite as much as he did a little bit later on. And the second time they came together, he said yes, because he felt like Bruce had gotten more into philosophy, which Joe was really heavy into philosophy, and was really integrating lots of different arts. And Joe was still fighting then and winning the titles. So he was pressure testing the concepts and theories that he and Bruce were talking about. So they had a good relationship, and Joe always spoke very, very highly of Bruce Lee and his athletic abilities, and spoke highly of him as a martial artist. And I think it speaks volumes, because you get a lot of the old, was Bruce Lee a martial artist debate, and he was just I'm like, well, look, Joe Louis was voted by all the tough guys of his era as the greatest fighter of all time, not once but twice. You know what I mean? He at the time was the first. He was a world champion as a full contact karate fighter, and world champion as a kickboxer, and he was by all the tough guys of that era. They all voted Joe as the man, and Joe was going to train, and Joe was training with Bruce Lee. You don't do that at the level that he's at unless you think that man's got something to offer. So I just, for me, that kind of settles that debate. I don't really go any further. And it's funny because people talk about what generation student are you? And I go, well, honestly, I'm a second generation Bruce Lee student because, one of my, most profound mentors trained with him privately. So I think that's kind of interesting.
And he even wrote a book about it,
Yeah.
which I have a copy of. I'm not sure when it came out. I think it was the 90s, but I picked it up after I kind of got aware of some of the stuff you're talking about. And another reason I've wanting to talk to you about all this is just kind of fill in some of the blanks. I mean, the guy's not around anymore for us to talk to, and you got to read articles, or like what you're saying you got to find people that knew him.
Yeah.
Just like with the Bruce Lee connection.
Oh, for sure. Joe was, if nothing, he was hardcore. One of the things that put Joe ahead of his time was he was into physical culture. Joe worked out. He had a physique on him, like a Greek god. He was well built. He worked out hard. You got to remember that back in that era, in the 60s, bodybuilding wasn't, exercise, fitness, weight training wasn't as much of a thing. Even in the NFL, people gotta, it's interesting. The NFL didn't incorporate strength coaches until the mid 70s. So that concept of physical culture, as it related, you played your sport. That's how you got in shape. Football players, they played football. Oh, I don't need anything. You want to get better at football, play football. Don't waste your time lifting those weights. Well, we've come to learn, well, that's not really true. That's not it. Because you look at the behemoths, the size of the guys and the times on their 40s and how fast the game is. Well, that Joe was involved in that kind of a physical culture way before that was cool. In terms of conditioning and training and strength training, and was fast at grip strength. You had these captains of crush grippers, and
Oh, I know, man. You got those in your truck.
Yeah,
I cannot squeeze them at all.
that guy. He could do them. Like the three. Like I couldn't. He had an incredible grip right up until the time he died. Joe worked out. I worked out with him on several occasions, and he came in, even next door to my gym. There's a guy that's got a really complete fitness training center, but does private training. He was a former Mr. Arkansas, and we'd go over there. Joe come in town, we'd go over there and lift. And I've got some weights, but not enough, and I've added to them over the years. But Joe, we always incorporated. When you worked out with Joe, you worked out. That was it. And sparring with Joe was absolutely no fun. His knuckles, and this is the thing that anybody that was around Joe would tell you, the size of his knuckles on his hands were grotesque. His smallest knuckle was bigger than my largest one, and he just had these hams for hands.
Was he just genetic? Did he condition that, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Was that
Yeah.
drill you were showing the other
Okinawa
day?
training. He did, and they trained hard in Okinawa, and he was into that kind of conditioning as a young man. And then and plus he just had big hands, I mean, he was just gifted. And so but through all the work and the knuckle work, he had developed up his hands. But when he hit you, I mean, you could feel his knuckles through hand wraps and boxing gloves. Like you could feel each individual knuckle as they hit you. And when you stood in front of Joe, if he was using you as an uke, it was a test of your manhood. You better, I mean, I'd get in front of Joe and kind of settle down and flex up and flare, because he, when he gave you a little oomph, he was fixing to rock you, from one side to the other. We formed, when we formed the Joe Louis fighting systems, and he had the Joe Louis American Karate System, and so a group of his black belts, we got together and kind of spearheaded by Mike Allen and some others, created a new organization for him. He kind of wanted, at that point in his career, he was wanting to separate himself a little bit from just karate. He didn't want to be pigeonholed. He wanted more an eclectic, fighting system that incorporated grappling. Joe was the first person. I remember I was at one of the seminars at Keith Kirk's school, and I'm a brand new black belt, and he's like, "What are you going to do if a big wrestler shoots at your ankles?" He'd wrestled in high school. I was like, I have really no idea when you put it like that, Joe. I mean, at that time, everybody kind of stayed in their lane a little bit as far as mixing, and I was pretty eclectic before eclectic was cool. I mean, I trained in Shotokan, I trained in Taekwondo, I trained with anybody that was, that was any good. I kind of tried to keep that open mind and learn from a lot of sources, but I'd never really been exposed to any quality grappling. He was the one, and then they were bringing at the karate college, they were bringing grapplers in, wrestlers and grapplers and ground fighters, from the get-go. And so that made it, and I had that interest. I had, we talk about this at a later date, but I had already had an opportunity to train with Horian in Hoist Gracie, like January of 91. So in the mid 90s, I had been already on the ground for a while, and we're going to these camps, and Joe was really big on people being well-rounded, out fighting, infighting, trapping, grappling, and on the mat. And so he brought a lot of guys in, and Joe was really picky about who he had in front of his black belts teaching. So at these conferences, I mean, just because you had high rank with Joe didn't mean you were going to get to teach at Joe's conference. He was just picky that way. He was very, very particular. And it was really fascinating to be around him. Dr. Manji was one of our mentors for the Joe Louis fighting systems. Well, Dr. G at the first kickboxing school in the country, which was, Burmese boxing, left way. I mean, that Bando system, and training with Dr. G was just like history. Every time you had an opportunity to be around him, it was really cool. And these guys, and Joe and Bill Wallace, and of course, Bill is another, because of Joe. I mean, those two guys are so profoundly, and they came out of the same school in Okinawa. Joe was there first, and a year later, a year after Joe left, Bill was there, and then
was this armed forces? He was in the armed forces.
Yeah. Okay. Joe was in the Marines, and Bill was in the Air Force, and they both were stationed in Okinawa, and they both ended up at the same gym, and the rest is kind of history. And so they they developed their own, due to their own stuff. Bill had blown his knee out playing judo, and so that's why they call him Superfoot. Is that the instructor said, well, when everybody switches sides, you just keep kicking with that leg. And so he kept one side forward, you know, and learned how to fight left side forward, did everything with his left leg. And, you know, they ended up developing their own styles based on their own physical attributes, which I think is so important. It's interesting because I hear that from so many people. Well, my game, you know, with jiu-jitsu, my game is, you know, I kind of is after Marcelo Garcia, or my game is this, or my game is that. And I'm like, you're not Marcelo Garcia. You should really try to just be the best you. Now, I train with Joe, but I don't have Joe's attributes. So I tried to absorb, you know, the process of absorbing what is useful. I train with Bill, but Lord knows, you know, God didn't gift me with that fast twitch muscle fiber that Bill Wallace had in his prime. But there is so much you can learn from Bill, just like there was so much I can learn from Joe. And then what you do is you filter through your own lens and you try to be the best version of you that you can be, you know, and that's always been my approach. I want the blessing of studying with these guys is not to try to be just like them, but to try to learn from them the elements or aspects of their game that is going to fit with yours without trying to be. I mean, there were things that Joe did that I can't do. I don't, you know, at my size and my weight, I can't do the things he could do in his prime, you know. I mean, just didn't quite work. But there was so much stuff that could work, you know. And in his later years, Joe developed, it's funny, like boxing katas. You know, we were talking as we were getting going about katas. But, you know, there's the information that he left and on putting combinations together and his mitt work and his analysis of fighters and his footwork. There is so much of that has guided me in my career. You know, from what I learned from Joe, I took for 14 years in a row. I went down to the IKF, the International Kickboxing Federation's World Amateur Championship, and I brought home world titles 14 years. You know, that I went down there, and then I had twice. I think I had as the most or as much as anybody there. We, you know, had a couple of good years, and of course having affiliates and bringing an Arkansas team together kind of under my banner. But a lot of the training that we would come together and do was based off of stuff that, you know, had learned that I'd learned from Joe and also learned from Bill. But Joe was such a huge influence, and he opened so many doors for me, because when Joe told somebody, hey, you need to bring this guy in for a seminar, hell, they'd bring me in for a seminar. You know, I got to teach at a pretty high level at a lot of camps and clinics. And, you know, it was always an honor that you have somebody that was such a pioneer of American fighting. I mean, Joe was mixing martial arts before that was cool. You know, I mean, he's his integration, his early kickboxing, his openness to grappling. I mean, because he wrestled in high school, he trained with Judo Gene LaBelle. You know, he was a big fan of those guys. And Henzo, big fan of Henzo's. Henzo showed up at right after Joe's death at you know, one of the conferences to share his story and time he spent with Joe. So what a huge legacy he left in American martial arts. And he was there at the beginning. I mean, he knew all the original players, and it was just really, it was really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, and his organization's still going to this day, and you're one of the ones involved in kind of carrying on the legacy. Is that not?
Yeah. And we keep, you know, Superfoot and Joe Louis fighting system. I mean, these guys need to be remembered and known. They paved the way for so many people, you know, to learn and to develop develop themselves. And there's a lot of great guys that, you know, and it's funny, everybody's got their Joe Louis stories, you know. I mean, Joe traveled a lot, just like Bill. man, they were all over the place. And they taught with a lot of people, and everybody's got their slice of the pie. You know, I mean, their reality of those guys. And from you know, the Dr. Beasley to the guys around the country that have been in the organizations, and spent time with Joe and helped them and worked with them and learned from them. And it's, you know, it's just absolutely, I think it's really, really a cool thing.
How many total years did you get to train with him? Do you know?
Off and on from the time I met him until the time he died. So just shortly after 81. And then after, you know, when I got back with him, you know, it was seminar only, but I mean, there were a lot of seminars in the early 80s up until about 88. And then there was about 4 or 5 years where we lost contact. And then several times a year from 93 or 94 on. From 94 on, I didn't miss a year. And we worked out several times because there were different camps and clinics and seminars. I hosted conferences for them. I had them in for seminars, and hosted some conferences. Would travel when I knew he was going to be at various conferences or other people's schools. So I got to spend a lot of time with Joe, you know, training with them and working out.
Did you, and you even hosted him? I think I missed it due to like the pants, or this was some tournament I was at out of state or something, but you hosted him, I believe, right the year he died. Am I not mistaken?
Yeah, the year before so Joe had been in Thailand filming a movie, and he flew in from Thailand, and I picked him up at the airport and could kind of tell a little bit off. But it was just, wasn't bad. I mean, it just, you know, we saw him so often. And he'd,
how old was he at this time? Like 70s? Sorry, I know I keep asking you a lot of date questions. I'm a historian. I suck at dates. So.
Yeah, no, I do too. And he was either late 60s or early 70s. Very early. I've got pictures. I was at his 60th birthday party in Tampa, Florida, and I've still got some pictures from that birthday party. And that might have been 10 years prior. So, I mean, it could have been, he was either late 60s, early 70s.
Good boy.
And then we, so that seminar, we did his mid-year conference at my gym. And then he went, that was the end of June. And then he and Bill Wallace went to Chuck Norris's ranch in Texas for the 4th of July. And Chuck Norris was the one that really was like, man, there's something off with Joe. He's not right. He needs to get checked. Something's, you know, he was having some memory issues, being forgetful. Joe, as I'd mentioned earlier, it was pretty much known for having a really, really great memory. Well, after that, he went and got checked, and that's when they found out that he had that's when he found out that he had brain cancer. I got the phone call. I was in the airport about to head to the International Masters and Seniors. So this was 2011. When he found out that he had cancer, and then he died in 2012. So that
68 years old is how old he was.
Yeah, 68. Okay, I knew he was late 60s. I didn't know. I couldn't remember if he'd quite hit 70 yet. Yeah, 68. And so he found out, and then but it was, you know, and it's a brutal process, you know, to watch that. It's just really, it's really difficult to watch people change, you know, the physiology and just that path is horrible.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I had a guy, friend of mine, works at a full-time care facility come on, and he deals only, his job is to only deal with patients with dementia or some sort of a degenerative brain disorder like that. That makes it to where they may be fully catatonic or they may be lucid sometimes. But it's just, man, to hear him talk about people living with just levels of dementia, it was eye-opening.
Yeah, it's hard to watch somebody you care about go downhill like that. After he passed, I had the honor of speaking at his memorial service in the evening. We all came together and had a banquet. They had his funeral during the day, and then that evening, various high ranks of Joe's got to get up and speak, and I was honored to be asked to speak. Joe came out of hospice to present me with my 7th degree. So I got my 7th degree from Joe. I was the last person to actually receive the 7th degree black belt from Joe personally, before he passed. And so that was an honor. I mean, he came over, they went and picked him up and brought him over to the conference. It was in Philadelphia, and was presented my 7th degree, went through that. That was pretty cool.
Where did he live for most of his life, or the later portions? Like, I mean, I know you've talked about him being in Thailand, all over the place, California. Where was he living?
So he's from Wilmington, North Carolina. He had lived in so he had lived in Wilmington. I'm not sure. I know he was from North Carolina. I'm not sure if he was actually. I know that might have been Raleigh area. I think he's buried outside of Raleigh. So he may have been originally from the Raleigh-Durham area. I'm not exactly sure.
That's kind of where he was when he towards the end there. Is that?
Yeah, I think he was actually in hospice up in Pennsylvania. Was where he was in hospice at, and then he had spent some time in Florida. You know, he'd lived around. He'd lived out in LA for a while, but then he had moved back into the North Carolina area. His kids were there. That's the area that he had been in. So, and then I know he was up in the King of outside of Philly was the hospice that he was in there at the end, was getting treated. So, and then he was buried there in Raleigh.
Yeah. Well, hey, so just kind of, and I appreciate you talking about all that at the end. I know that's not easy to be remembering. I wouldn't. Those would be the parts that I would want to remember, all the good times, all the good memories.
Yeah, you know, I get fuzzy on some of that stuff because I tend to compartmentalize and push past that, and that's not what I focus on. You know, I can tell you, I remember, you know, sparring with Joe. I was down in Monroe, East Monroe, Sparky McDuffie's gym in West Monroe, Louisiana. I don't know why I said East, West Monroe. Through with big old heavy leather headgear and 16-ounce gloves, he left pump knots on my forehead. 3 rounds with Joe was always a challenge, you know. I mean, all the guys that originally got their black belt from Joe personally had to go 3 rounds with him. And now I know how a mouse feels when he's being played with by a large cat. I mean, you know, you step up and hit somebody and nothing happens. it's always a really, really bad feeling, you know. I mean, I'm just whacking them and nothing. Just, and then when he hits you, you kind of moved, you know. You just would tend to not be there anymore. But he liked to laugh, you know. I mean, we laughed a lot, and I don't know. I like to mess with Joe. Of course, it was kind of like messing with your life, but I think he always kind of deep down respected that. So and he just such an interesting character, you know, man of contrast for sure. So those are the good times and the things that I really try to hang on to.
For sure. Just wrapping up, do you have like a favorite memory you haven't hit on already? Something that just, man, I'm never going to forget that moment with that guy.
No, I mean, there's definitely flashes here and there. You know, I hold on to the times that he'd give me a rare compliment. You know, it was like, I remember him one time in High Point, North Carolina. We were teaching at a seminar, and after I got through teaching, he gave me a compliment that, hell, I called my dad. I was like, "Hey, Joe said this," and he never says anything nice. You know, I mean, it tugged at my heartstrings. So it was, those were the kind of memories that I personally, you know, meant so much, because I mean, I worked so hard and still do. I mean, it's amazing how deeply and profoundly I was influenced from the time I was a colored belt teenager. You know, I mean, I was a teenage kid when I was, you know, first studying him and meeting him and being influenced by him, you know, through my adult years to, you know, and still trying to maintain his teachings and his in his philosophy, you know, today. And that that means so much to me. And that's one thing. I mean, I owed you know, Joe, like I said, opened a lot of doors for me personally and influenced my career in so many ways, from, you know, getting vested in grappling and ground fighting to, you know, as a coach, really trying to, you know, Joe would say, "Hey man, champions come and champions go, but a good coach is around for a long time." You know, I mean, sometimes one of his favorite sayings, you know, sometimes a master, always a student. So Joe would continue to grow. Even towards the end, I can remember I would get emails from Joe, and he would include me in these email strings with all kinds of people. Like, you know, it was interesting, but he was doing video breakdown of fights up until the time he passed. He would send, you know, I'd get an email and you'd look at the timestamp. It was 2:30 in the morning, and he'd been watching fight videos, and he goes, "Now watch this guy at this, you know, 1 minute, 8 seconds in the second round. He does this. Now he does it again at this time. Now watch how he sets him up with this, but then he does that and breaks the rhythm." And I mean, he would do these great analysis of fights and these video breakdowns. And, you know, that was classic Joe, you know, the way he operated and the way he thought, you know. So I thought that was interesting. And I'm looking at it, you know, so I show up and I'm getting ready to do my morning workout, and I've got, you know, a couple of emails from Joe, you know, wanting me to look at fight breakdowns. And that just was cool. I mean, you know, how awesome was that?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Dring, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about Joe. And I know we got some more episodes planned on down the road, spacing them out. And people that are coming up, like Bill Wallace, Superfoot. And man, you've done so much. I wouldn't want to do an episode just talking to you, like, tell me everything you've done. you know, because I just don't think that could do it justice. Like a lot of the martial artists I'm talking to on my show, that is it. Like, well, how'd you get into martial arts? And they're, you know, they do jiu-jitsu, maybe karate or something, you know, like Daniel O'Brien, that was him. But man, you've been in so long, and you've trained with some incredible martial artists. I really appreciate you talking to me about each art and about these influential people in your life.
Well, thank you. Because Joe, I mean, sharing these stories is huge. I don't, you know, a lot of times it's not what have you done, it's what have you done lately as a martial artist, you know, and I guess everybody wants to sit around and talk about their glory days, but that's a piece of American martial art history, you know, love them or hate them. You know, there was once upon a time in Hollywood.
Have you seen that? I haven't seen it yet.
Yes, we
Is it
watched
super
it
good
the other day, but there's a reference to Joe Louis. You know, it's got a Bruce Lee scene, and he makes a reference. You know, no, not the boxer, that asshole you know, karate guy or something. And it was funny. I mean, it made me laugh. But I mean, there's not a doubt he left his mark on American martial arts history, and I feel really, really privileged to have been a part of that legacy. You know, I think that's really, for me, it's really cool. And I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to kind of share some of my old stories and reminisce a little bit. It's good times.
Well, it's great. Just getting to hear all of it. It's history and it's martial arts, and I love both. So,
right.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Well, Coach, I really appreciate it again, and I hope you have an awesome day, and everybody stays safe and healthy in your direction. So,
yep, right back at you, brother, and I look forward to the next time we get to sit down.
Yes, sir. I'll hit you up, and we'll schedule another episode soon.
Great. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.